Hey guys, it's been quite a long time, hasn't it? Well, good to see you guys again. We're going to be talking about quite a off topic, or kind of a unconventional topic, I guess, subtlety. Do you like it? Is there something wrong with it? Uh, is subtlety preferable? What kind of society do we live in? Is it a subtle society? What kind of person are you? Are you a subtle person or not? And then what about nature? Is nature subtle or is nature not subtle? Think about a peacock and a peacock's tail. Think about when the seasons change. Is it overt or is it covert? All that kind of thing. So we are going to deal with Van Gogh's letters. We are going to um, return to the 7th of January following the ear incident. But before we get to that, we're going to just talk a little bit about subtlety. And so I want to start kind of the conversation off with looking at nature, and then I'm going to bring it to the point that I kind of want to make. And it's something that's quite personal to me and something that's in a way quite personal to this channel, in kind of a heartbreaking way. So we are going to get to that. Let's just have a look at some of the comments. Stephanie says, I'm not subtle at all. Okay. Stephanie says, I can only stay for a little bit. I'm ready now. Anyway, good to see you, Stephanie. Lynn Lippy, also really good to see you guys. All the usual suspects, Chelsea, good to see you guys. So on screen is, you guys know what that is? I'm sure if you're in America, you do. I think you guys call it a prairie dog. In South Africa, we call them ground squirrels. But it's basically the same animal. And and they are pretty. It's like pretty obvious if you spent any time photographing them. It's pretty obvious what which is the male ground squirrel and which is the female. The males have got very big what's the word, balls, for the lack of a better word. So there are some animals where sexuality is very, very overt. Like often with birds, it's like that. With antelope, the males have got big horns, right? And so sometimes that kind of transparency is necessary. Whereas in certain other animals, also, it's a lot less obvious. I used to breed lovebirds, and the lovebirds are virtually identical. I think you've got to like take them to a doctor or a veterinarian in order to make sure that you've got a male and a female, because they are so similar. So ground squirrels, although they have the same colors, they certainly are. Uh, at a glance, you can kind of see which one's the male, which one's the female. What do you think of that? Not a bad photo, right? Quite a detailed photo. Now, something that really surprised me recently is all of these photos, by the way, are taken at my father's farm. But what really surprised me was I went there looking for 3 giraffe. I actually went with a friend of mine, and we spent probably an hour looking for 3 giraffe, and we just couldn't find them. And you would imagine that an animal with such a long neck would be so obvious, so easy to see, and it took a really long time to find them. So that's kind of a subtlety. So let me ask you guys, like in a general sense, what's your perception of nature? Is nature subtle or not? And I realize it's a fairly weird question to ask, because I'm not really giving a lot of context. I mean, I think you've got to ask that question in context. Subtle in what context? But I'm going to, without giving you the context, I'm just going to ask you, in your opinion, is nature, the way you know it, subtle or not? What would you say? Stephanie says some nature is not. Thanks a lot, Mel. So Mel Stiller says camouflage by the trees. Now, if you think about that aspect, the fact that nature tries to camouflage itself, right? That nature tries to hide itself away, nature hiding from nature. Would you say that that is a sign of subtlety, or what? And I think if you spent any significant amount of time in wild places, I think you realize just how subtle nature is in terms of there's an animal right in front of you, but you don't see it. Um, whether you're in the woods or in the wilderness, nature abounds, but we simply don't see it because nature's designed within the environment often not to be seen, right? Elise, really good to see you. Good to see you. Okay, so let's go on to the next picture. So I think probably this is a good place to just pause for a second and just say, when I was in this situation, remember, I'm now carrying a camera. It's got quite a long lens, and we're looking for these giraffe, and we just can't find them. And yet, as we're walking through this more and more dense bushveld, we sort of realize there's dozens of animals, not one or two, but at least 20 or 30 or 40 animals that are kind of subtly moving in kind of a tapestry, kind of just beyond where you can see. And when you sort of move to that area, then they sort of what's the word? They don't surround you, but they do a sort of circuitous movement. In other words, they seem to keep a minimum safe distance, but they seem to kind of want to know where you are. And it's quite a funny thing with baboons and leopards. When leopards chase baboons or monkeys, the monkeys always want to still be able to see where the leopard is, which can sometimes be their undoing. But anyway, in this particular instance, you first saw one or two animals, then you realized, wow, there's more than five animals. Then you saw, wow, there's actually easily a dozen. Next thing you saw, there were actually three species. There were these antelope, the wildebeest, and then you can't see them in this picture, but there were also zebra. And so it's just a kind of a intro to this whole idea of subtlety in nature. So I'll just take you through the last couple of pictures of this ground squirrel. I think we're almost done. And so, yeah, that kind of brings us a bit closer to home, literally. This is a photo of a nest taken in my garden. Weaver nest, by the way, I've lost count now how many times this weaver's built nests and demolished them. And I've also kind of lost track of like what is the problem when some of these nests get demolished. And so there's some subtlety in these nests where the female decides for whatever reason, either the entrance hole, the entry into the nest is too big or too small. If it's too big, the chicks can fall out. If it's too small, it might get too cold, get too hot inside. Um, uh, I'm just trying to think what the possibilities are. She may not like the fact that it's oriented too much into the wind, because the wind typically comes from a certain direction. She may not like that it's oriented too much into the sun or too much in the shade. But whatever the answer is, those subtleties have made this poor little male bird build easily 20 nests by now. And right now in my garden, there are four nests. I think two are occupied and two have chicks inside or something. But he's easily built 20 nests in the time that I've been paying attention to him. And you sort of got to wonder, what is the problem, kind of thing. So as far as the weaver bird is concerned, there's a heck of a lot of subtlety in getting these nests right. And if you look at these nests, what is the difference between, what is the obvious difference between one nest and another nest? if he's asked to pull apart one of these nests, what is the problem with the one compared to the other? I mean, they seem to be just about as good as one another, right? And so I think that's his question. That's the question he's also asking is, okay, well, what is the subtle issue that I need to figure out here? And so now I want to turn this whole question onto myself and just share with you guys quite a sad and troubling experience I've had. And funnily enough, there's a couple of them back to back that have been really, really subtle and really difficult to figure out. And so I think we're going to start off with this. Let's just put this over here. Anyone know what we're looking at there? Anyone know what we're looking at? Yes, I am sure it's him taking them down because I've seen him taking it down, and it is typically the male that pulls apart his own nest. Well, he seems to be building nests all day, every day, day after day, week after week. So it's kind of all the time. He's a very, very energetic bird. So yeah, those are the peach trees, and can you kind of spot a difference between the two trees? This photo was taken on in January last year, so last summer. And which tree would you say is the healthier tree, the happier tree? I'll give you a little bit of background. That the tree on the right is closer to the wall, to kind of the side of where I stay, side of the house, and as a result gets more shade than the other one. The other tree, yeah, I mean that's probably the biggest difference. The other tree gets a lot more sun, right? Melstiller says the one on the right is larger. Okay. Initially, the tree on the left was taller and larger, and I kind of had to prune it back. So one of the reasons why in this picture the tree on the right is larger is because it was to begin with in the shade a lot and that sort of thing. Anyway, let me cut to the chase, and I think this might shock some of you. One of these trees died, right? One of these two trees in this picture died. And so which tree do you think it was? Which tree do you think has got some critical life-threatening situation facing it? Just looking at this picture. Which tree do you think of these two trees died? So Stephanie says, is it the one on the right? Mel says, is it the one on the left? It was really sad. It definitely was pretty sad. Zircon says the one with the suckers at the bottom. Elise says the right side one. Chelsea says the one on the right. Well, the answer is the one on the left. And just in terms of subtlety, what I definitely noticed between the two trees was the tree on the right kept its leaves abnormally long. It kept its leaves throughout much of the coldest weather in winter, whereas the other tree had long since thrown off all of its leaves. And then I actually thought that the tree on the right would regain its leaves after the tree on the left. And not only did it throw its leaves off much later, it also got, it was budding and producing leaves much sooner. And I thought, wow, it's pretty incredible how different the personalities of the same kind of species of tree was. And then I sort of noticed, wow, the tree on the right, the leaves have come out completely, the buds are out, and the other one, although the buds have emerged, hasn't progressed any further than that. And then in the beginning, I thought, wow, just really interesting how different trees are, except the tree on the right just continued to grow. And just look how healthy both those trees look. They look like very happy, healthy young trees. And then eventually I just realized, wow, something seems to be wrong here. The tree on the left, just nothing is happening. And then I wondered, is it a late bloomer? Is something wrong? And then it was really looking at the tree and trying to see the subtlety. Is this tree alive or is the tree not alive? And that is kind of where this whole idea sort of hit me. Is we are actually quite bad in a way at dealing with subtlety and things that are not our area. And so looking at this tree, it's got hundreds of buds, but they're just not coming out. And so what I was looking for was just a little piece of green somewhere, just that little bit of green that is a sign of new life. And unfortunately, it just wasn't happening. So, days went by, then weeks went by, and I just wasn't seeing that. And eventually I was faced with a horrible conclusion or the horrible reality that this tree had actually died. Like, I'd watered both of them the same amount. If anything, it seemed like the tree on the left had a better, had better conditions, more sunlight. Peach trees like full sun. And next thing, the tree's dead. And I want to show you some photos of the whole situation. Okay, so let's bring this up. So I don't know if you can see the picture in front of you. Let's make it full screen and just enlarge it slightly. Let's just do that. So they have actually excavated the hole. It's quite difficult because it's tiled around there. And there you can see, because now we kind of in a way doing like a forensic analysis. Like I was literally digging this tree up, and now you're sort of performing, as an amateur, of course, performing a kind of autopsy. Like what went wrong with this tree? What's going on? Like what is happening here, kind of thing. And one of the obvious places to start is you look at the soil and you say, well, was there something wrong with the soil, right? And you can see sort of over there to some extent. It's not that clear in this picture, but there was a fair amount of potting soil with the tree, and it didn't seem like an obvious reason why the tree had died, because of the soil. The soil didn't seem particularly good or particularly bad. And the other thing to argue is that the soil on both sides is similar. I won't say it's the same, but it was a similar composition. And yeah, so these are pretty good questions from you guys. Stephanie says, was the soil dry? Zircon says drainage, it looks clayish. And that is a very, that I feel is kind of on the right track. And so can you see what we're starting to suggest? We're starting to suggest, did one of these trees growing in virtually identical, Timmy, come boy. Did one of these trees growing in virtually an identical setting get too much water or too little water? Was something going on below the surface, not above the ground? Nothing to do with light. Was something going on below the surface that was actually lethal at the end of the day? Okay, come. Timmy says hello to you guys. He's got a little bit of a, let's just do this. Timmy, so hello. Come. Hello. Timmy's got a little bit of a skin rash, so he's a little bit itchy, but I think he'll survive. It seems to be a schnauzer thing that they get little bumps on their skin every now and then. So another subtlety with regard to schnauzers, right? So anyway, um, so what with this additional context, this additional information, what would you say was the difference between the one tree and the other tree in terms of what they had to deal with? Now, bear in mind. Okay, let's just see what you guys say. Stephanie says, I think brick walls on both sides. Maybe the sun hits. Okay. Okay. So anyway, let's go on to the next image. Okay, so that's a picture of the sort of root. I mean, it's not obviously the full root system. I had to dig the plant out and so on. But this is I mean, you can see it definitely is a dead tree. And it really was quite sad, like digging around in the ground at something that had, instead of nourishing this tree, had actually somehow killed it. And it really was quite a grim thing to be doing. I never thought I'd plant a tree and then end up digging up the tree. I'm not saying it's like a child, but it's something that you try to give life to, and it looked like it would have a good life, and the next thing you're doing this. And so anyway, let's go on to the next image. I think it's this one. So instead of anyway, hang on, let me just go to the previous one that shows the soil, or this one. So if we want to do a kind of an autopsy, and obviously I appreciate I'm not a botanist, I'm not who's the guy in The Martian? Can't remember his name, but I'm not that guy. But I don't know if it takes a rocket scientist to say, this soil doesn't look particularly good. Look at all the stones in this ground, right? Or look at these sort of biggish stones, and you can't see it in this particular image, but I even took out a brick that was about the size of my fist out of this ground this hole that I dug up. And obviously I was very aware and very concerned. I don't want to just dig the tree up, excavate the hole and then just put another tree in it and hope for the best. I didn't want to potentially put another tree through the same thing. So what can I see here that is, it's definitely not obvious, but something's going on here that I can somehow mitigate and help the chances of the next tree. And another question to ask was, do I plant another peach tree where the previous peach tree has died, or do I plant some other tree? What should I do? Mel says the soil looks dry and infertile. So a couple of you are saying that. Okay, so the issue wasn't dryness; it's the opposite. It was wet. I don't know if that's a bad photo, but the soil was actually, so it wasn't chocolate mousse muddy, so it wasn't extremely wet, but it was moist enough where it was basically moist from top to bottom. I really thought I took a photo of this, but I apparently didn't. Or if I did, I'm not quite sure where it is. But anyway, inside the hole, let me see if I can get a picture that sort of shows you what I'm talking about. Might be, it's not that picture. It's actually none of these pictures. I wonder where I can find it. to see if I can, if I did email it to myself. So please bear with me for a second. While you're waiting, is a picture of Timmy beside the tree. Let's just see if I can find it. It's not that one. It's not that one. Strange. I really thought I had it. Okay, so let's just have a look at this picture while we're here. Is it this one? This is a picture of the one peach tree that is got leaves on. You can see it's even starting to produce peaches, right? Let's blow it up a little. And then you can see on the other side, you can see it's got buds, but the buds just aren't blooming. And so you think, well, they're going to bloom any second, but then they just don't. That's what I mean by subtlety. How do you know that this tree isn't alive, right? And so I'm pretty sure I did email it to myself. I think there's another one here. Is it this one? Okay. Unfortunately, I can't find it. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't find it. But it's basically it's a photo of the hole, and you can kind of see that there's a section of the pillar, in terms of the foundation of the pillar of the gate, and it's enlarged because of the muddy substrate. It's much larger than it would normally be, and because of the way that the trees are planted, that concrete block creates a kind of a obstruction for drainage, and also an obstruction for the roots to go where they want to go, right? And I think if you go back to this image, you can probably see it a lot clearer if you're standing there, and I pointed it out to you, but basically, can you see that this tree over here is kind of to this side, to the left of this big block? Now, if you had X-ray vision and you could see underground, you'd see a very large block under this particular pillar over here. Now, if you look at this side, it's a little bit difficult to see from this angle, but this tree is almost in line with the edge of this block. So the block would probably go sort of like that and then like that. It's almost to the edge of this block, whereas in terms of this one, the block goes much further and sort of in a large way cuts off a lot of the drainage of the water. Anyway, long story short, I think the reason why the one tree, although it was in the sun and more in the sun than the other, I think that, and also, even though it had blueberries draining the soil even more than the other tree, I think the reason the one tree died was during winter, I watered it like once a week or whatever it was. I watered both trees throughout their lives the same amount. It was never that I watered the one more than the other. But the main difference is, I think, that the drainage of the tree that died was slightly worse. Not a lot worse, slightly worse than the other one. The other thing, and I'm really feel stupid because I remember digging in the hole. I even shone a torch down there and I seem to remember taking a photo, but I'm not quite sure what I did with it. But the other thing is, at the bottom of this hole was some amount of utility things, like there was a cable, not a very big cable, about as thick as my finger. And then there was also some kind of plastic tubing, a little bit thicker maybe about that thick. And again, neither of those things on their own are going to be enough to cause a problem. But if you take that and bricks the size of my fist and other kind of rubble, biggish stones, and then you've also got this big concrete block, all of that is making life harder and harder for this tree. And then if you also watering it in winter, then and it's not growing in winter, then that is a way that its roots are literally going to drown in the soil. And that is what I think happened. And I think the fact that the other tree was just programmed to keep its leaves on till much later and make leaves as ASAP, that subtle difference, that small difference in terms of that is what made all the difference between one tree now being alive and the other one not. Isn't that kind of quite fascinating? I mean, it's quite terrifying in a way that such a small thing can be such a serious thing for a tree. But it's also quite kind of astonishing how things like that can kind of manifest around us. So anyway, what I ended up doing was like I said, I tried to make sure I understood what went wrong. I decided in the end not to plant another peach tree in the same space. I don't know, as I said, I'm not a bit botanist. I didn't plant another peach tree in that space. I planted an apple tree. Apple trees grow slightly taller, and so I imagine their roots go down slightly deeper. The other thing is, as you can see, this tree did fine in summer. The tree on the left was absolutely fine in summer. And so I think the lesson to learn out of this is certainly the tree in the left, but probably also the tree on the right, probably don't water them in winter, like at all. Maybe once in winter, but rather not water them at all in winter. And so so this is a picture of the apple tree. I don't know if you guys know that according to his biography, Neil Armstrong climbed an apple tree when he came up as a little boy and when he was thinking about going to the moon. So anyway, so there's the apple tree. It's at this point much smaller than the peach tree next to it. I'm just trying to see if I've got there you can kind of see the apple tree. It's much smaller than the peach tree. I probably emptied about 3/4 of a bag of potting soil into the hole and removed most of the biggish pieces of stone and the soil that seemed not of a good quality. I didn't put back into the hole. And also, I don't know if you can see there. Let's do this. I purposely planted the tree on the far side of the hole, as far as possible from this wall, and to some extent to this side, so that it can kind of escape the concrete block that sort of comes up over here. So we'll see what happens. Obviously I want to learn the lesson in terms of what happened to the other tree. So yeah. So that's the situation. And for those of you who know, I mean, this channel was in a way came about as a result of planting these two peach trees, and the one in the shade, was it going to survive? And it's thriving and it's doing really well. And it's, I mean, who would have thought that the other tree would end up dying? It's really quite astonishing. I don't think it's a dwarf apple tree, but it's the apple tree that makes the red apples. Stephanie says, I need to put a grocery order away. Okay. Yeah, I actually think there were too many obstructions. So, there's a pipe, there's a cable, there's a big block. There were pieces of brick. There were lots of biggish stones. The other thing that I think is quite important to mention, also in terms of subtlety, is you could say, well, wasn't there a disease in the soil? Not that I could see. There were, I think I pulled out about 4 earthworms. So I think that's a sign that the soil was actually in relatively good shape. Not ideal, far from ideal, but also not terrible, and I don't think necessarily toxic either. Okay, so Timmy, I'm going to put you down. Say goodbye. And that kind of then brings us to something that's a bit more general. In terms of subtlety, if you think about dogs and cats, dogs are pretty unsubtle, cats are subtle. Some people prefer dogs, some people prefer cats for that very reason. Some people like people that are very obvious, very extroverted, very transparent. You sort of feel like you know who you're dealing with, right? And if you think about it in a very kind of black and white sense, um, whether if you let's say you're heterosexual, and don't you like if you're a man, don't you like a woman who's very obvious in her feelings towards you? If you're a woman, don't you like a man who's very obvious in his feelings towards you? And I think Russell Brand's popularity is because he's someone who is absolutely transparent, or he was, in the fact that he's saying, I'm sexually available and blah 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 blah. And there's some women that find that disarming and attractive. And there's some men, probably quite a few men, who like women who are the same way. But I think many of us will agree, especially if you're older, I think you'll agree that people who tend to be extremely sexually transparent maybe aren't the best partners for you, because that suggests they may be sexually transparent to someone else as well. In other words, they're sexually transparent to you, saying, hey, I'm available. Well, wouldn't they also say the same thing to somebody else, right? And so can you see that's where it becomes, maybe on the face of it, especially if you're a young person, you might say, wow, I really like the fact that this person likes me. But that person may also just like, it might be a girl who likes lots of boys, or a boy who likes lots of girls. Or, if you homosexual or whatever it is, I'm free, you know what I'm saying? And so that's kind of another side to subtlety, isn't it? Zircon says looked like root rot. When you Google it as well, and when I mean, my father knows quite a lot about plants. He was saying a sign of overwatering is when the leaves turn yellow. And I did notice the blueberry bushes below the tree were looking quite yellow. So they didn't die, even though they were in the same soil, but they definitely did change color a little bit. Okay, so the next thing I kind of want to share with you guys, cats are super mysterious, is this book. I'm reading a book called How Big Things Get Done. It's a really fascinating book with lots of interesting anecdotes. I want to share one with you guys that has that kind of connects to this idea of the opposite of subtlety. How the fact that a lot of people aren't subtle, or appreciate things that aren't subtle, how easy they are manipulated, right? So the way that most people are in terms of our psychology is that we anchor ourselves to certain signs or signals. So if there's a sign or a signal that is clear and obvious, we anchor ourselves, we anchor our psychology to these signs or signals, right? You might say, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Well, let me explain it. I'm reading from page 102 of How Big Things Get Done. And I'm basically touching on this idea that, I don't know if you guys can read that. we are anchored by the obvious. And you might say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with being anchored by the obvious? And I mean, I was anchored by the thing of, well, I'm watering the one peach tree, I'll water the other peach tree. They both have exactly the same. They both have exactly the same. They're both in absolutely equal circumstances, and the answer is actually no, they're not. So I'm reading from page 102 midway through. Unfortunately, it is easy to settle on a bad anchor. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky pioneered research on this in a famous 1974 paper that included one of the strange experiments in the history of psychology. So what the author's already acknowledging is that this was a strange experiment. It wasn't typical, put it that way. Sorry, Mel. I'm just showing you very quickly. You don't have to be able to read it. So then he says, so the experiment involved creating a wheel of fortune, the dial of which displayed numbers from 1 to 100. So basically, in this experiment, he doesn't say who the people were and how the sample of people were drawn. That's not really mentioned, but basically, they kind of had a wheel of fortune type setup with the numbers on this wheel from 1 to 100. Then they'd spin this wheel in order to generate a random number, and then they would ask people a particular question. So he says, and this is the question, they asked subjects to estimate the percentage of UN members, United Nations members, that are African. Now, there was nothing in this experiment that was political or had no racial thing about it. It was simply to test psychological anchoring. That was the point of it. So literally they would spin this wheel and then they'd ask someone, and then the wheel would stop on a number. Then they'd ask someone, okay, look at that number. Okay, now we're going to ask you, how many people in the United Nations would you say are African? What do you think the proportion is? Even though the number the wheel had selected was blatantly irrelevant, I mean, can you appreciate that? Can you appreciate with this wheel spinning? It's got absolutely nothing to do with the fact of the number of Africans represented in the United Nations. It's completely random and irrelevant, right? And even though the people that were part of the sample knew that as well, this was what happened. When the Wheel of Fortune stopped, for instance, on 10, the median guess, meaning the average guess, was 25%. So the average guess for people when the number was that was 25%, right? But when it landed on 65, the median guess was 45%, almost twice as much. The correct answer at the time of the experiment was 29%. Much subsequent research revealed that people will anchor in almost any number they happen to be exposed to prior to making their forecast. Now, you might say, that is so what? What is the point? That is a pointless experiment until you read onto the next page, 103. Let me just read that again, where he says, much subsequent research revealed that people will anchor in almost any number they happen to be exposed to prior to making their forecast. And so, guess who really appreciated this? I don't know what you want to call it, anomaly, this revelation in terms of our psychological wiring. Marketers saw this and they thought, this is awesome. And so they would do the following. They would say, when you encounter a limit 6 per customer sign, that is the sort of thing that came out as a result of this research. So when you see a limit 6 per customer sign at a grocery store, there's a good chance that that sign is there to expose you to the number 6, making it the anchor when you decide how many items to buy. And then you can kind of take all of this further and also think about how prior experience is an anchor and how that can be used as well. Anyway, I'm not going to take this particular subject matter further than that, but it is quite fascinating. Now, I do feel, in a way, we've created this channel around this idea of thriving in the shadow and the whole peach tree thing. But can you see that whole symbolic construct now is to some extent invalid, right? And so I think part of the team peach, part of the genuine team Peachtree psychology needs to be that you need to thrive, but with a acknowledgement of the reality of subtlety. That thriving isn't an obvious business, that there's some subtle things about ourselves and about our worlds that if you don't know, you are just not going to thrive. And so you do need to pay attention to those details, right? So I'm glad we've got a wow from Zircon. I think now is a good time to vote on that question. I don't know if you guys have voted yet. I'm just going to have a look at it quickly. Are you good at subtlety? And you can either answer that in the context of this live stream, or you can just think generally. Do I think I am good at it? So 40%, 45% of you say yes. Well, now it's 42%. Or it is changing all the time. So most of you think that you are good at subtlety. Now, in the context of this experiment or this analogy with the peach tree, when you looked at those peach trees, both of them, were you able to tell at a glance that the one was going to die, that the one was not going to make it through the winter? So that is one. You might say, okay, but that's still not very helpful. I'm going to give you another example, and again, I mean, if you said to me, Nick, it's actually your fault that tree died. You should have known not to water it in winter. You should have known the soil was wet or damp or whatever. And now let's go on to another example. So recently I've set up a security system in my home, and I've set up cameras all over the place. And then I don't know if you guys know, I went away. I went to the Wild Coast for a couple of days. And while I was away, the one security camera just stopped working, which was definitely concerning. It's like, wow, is there something wrong with the camera? Is there something wrong with something else? Has it been sabotaged by someone? Are these Ring cameras reliable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so when I came home, I thought, well, let me just fix the camera and get the show back on the road. And then I couldn't fix the camera, right? And I called Ring up and I spoke to their customer service, and they took me through a step-by-step thing. And this is also why I think we are not generally, all of us are not that good at subtlety. Even the guy on the line basically probably had a formulaic questionnaire, and when we went through it from one end to the other, he basically assumed this camera must be defective, and he said, we're going to replace your defective item, right? Now, we're already almost an hour into this. I do want to get to Van Gogh letters. We'll get to it in about 10 minutes. But the thing that I wanted to touch on is the process that he took me through was, is the power outlet on? Yes. Is the camera blinking? No. Anyway, just like a whole series of questions from the one to the other. And anyway, so I ended up replacing the camera, and then after replacing the camera, it turned out the camera wasn't the issue at all. It was this, right? Now, this is in a way a weird analogy to this, in a weird way. So, if you look at these two, we call them plugs. I'm not sure if you call them chargers or sockets or whatever. What do you guys call these? You call it an outlet. Silent Member says, I don't know. So this was actually the problem. What do you think the problem was here? Outlets, okay. What do you think the problem was? And also looking at this, which one would you say is defective? Switch, okay. Which one of these two would you say is defective? And obviously, it's almost it's a weird analogy to what you've just dealt with these peach trees, because in order to find out what was going on with the peach trees, you had to dig below the surface, right? Well, in this sense, if you look under the surface, you can see that there's scoring, and it's burnt, right? Burnt wiring. And I'm not really sure what the normal plate looks like on the other side, but it's clear that there's a lot that is not right with this one, right? And the answer is actually that both of these plugs were defective, not just the one, because that is something that I did. I thought that it could be something wrong with the plug or the socket, and so I plugged it into the other one and it still didn't work. But then why did it work to begin with? Well, why did this peach tree work to begin with? Well, because there was something subtle that was, I guess, life enhancing or not coming into play within those circumstances, in the same way that there's something subtle that was coming into play after a certain period where the camera had been plugged in, where for whatever reason, because it's turning on and off, and the current, I guess, is being activated in a different way, and this plug didn't like it, right? What I'm trying to get at is, it seems quite simple. Either the camera's broken, or this or that, or the next thing, and it wasn't necessarily that simple. It turned out that I needed an electrician to come and, when I sent the camera away, I actually thought, you know what, I actually don't think it's the camera. But the Ring folks thought it was, so you kind of think, well, maybe they've had problems with it or whatever. But there's another example where you're relying on, in a way, the legacy of a system that you've kind of inherited. So like when I moved into my home, you don't go and check every plug and every socket. You assume that whatever was done is fine and that it works, right? And then there are subtle signs. So for example, when the one peach tree started showing its leaves, maybe that would have been a time to take some sort of action. In the same way, there was a time that I was at my office and I smelt plastic burning, and I just couldn't identify what the source was of it. Well, it was obviously from here, right? And so it's kind of subtle. It's like, is that plastic burning? I'm not quite sure. I can't tell where it's coming from. And then you don't solve that problem, and then, well, ultimately it manifests somewhere else. This security camera doesn't work. Well, that's why, right? And I do think if you believe that you are very good at subtlety, then I don't know whether you are. I think it's a little bit like saying to someone, "Are you good at body language?" I think if you say, "I'm good at body language," you probably aren't, because you are overconfident. I think if you if you believe that, like, trying to think where, I think it's from Thor, where he says, I have much to learn, right? I think if you have that attitude in terms of subtlety, then you are going to pick up subtle things that you need to pick up, because you realize there's something I'm not seeing here, and then you're going to continue asking questions and thinking critically. It's when you believe that you um, are good in your thinking, good in your analysis, that you are riding on your own coattails, and that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. You've got to ask yourself, what am I not seeing, right? Let's have a look at what you guys are saying. Yeah, the tree on the right survived. Well, what being good at means, in my opinion, I think I'm better than most people at, in terms of perceiving subtle things in different situations. Malstiller says, I tend to pay closer attention to what is said, not what is shown. So, so again, I want to apply this to me. You know, if I look at my fellow true crime creators and I arrogantly say, wow, you guys don't know what you're talking about, then I'm actually going to become worse at what I'm doing. Does that make sense? If I look at the people around me and I decide I'm more sensitive, I'm more intelligent, I'm smart in this aspect or that aspect, it may even be true. But the more that I think that or believe that, the less effort I'm going to be putting into thinking about things, right? Does that make sense? You know, that as soon as you, it's almost like you get poisoned by your own hubris, even if it's true. Um, you're going to not work as hard because you're sort of feeling, well, the way I am now is sufficient. I don't really need to work any harder, right? And I think a very big difference between these two trees is the tree on the right had to work much harder than the tree on the left for a variety of reasons. The tree on the right, when I bought it, was a much shorter tree than the tree on the left. The tree on the right very quickly was being dominated by the tree on the left, to the extent that the tree on the left's branches were taking sunlight and all this kind of thing. And so the tree on the right had to sort of pick it up by its bootstraps, kind of thing. You know, it had to work a lot harder, it had to work harder to get sunshine, it had to work harder to get less sunshine than the other tree was getting. It had, yeah. Um, so, so in the end, the fact that that tree worked as hard as it did meant that it was taking more moisture out the soil for a longer period, and that seems to be what made the difference between the one and the other. There is one additional aspect, and I don't know if you've noticed it. Let's do one final test before we go into Van Gogh, to test your attention to detail and your critical thinking. Look at this picture again, and tell me if you can see something that is different between the two trees, but that we haven't mentioned yet. No, the tree on the left received more light consistently. Yeah, that's right. Lamtoon, good to see you here. Okay, so the question is, looking at this picture, there's something in this picture that we haven't spoken about that is a important difference between the two trees. What is it? it's a good suggestion, but someone has already mentioned that. I think what you mean is that, right? You mean that uh, framed area provides a kind of a lip, whereas that doesn't. There's no lip on that side, right? There you go, Laura. It's good to see you here. There you go. And so if you think about it, could that not have made a difference as well? Because, and the reason I put the lip on the one side was that's the side where water drains directly from the roof onto this patio, right? And then flows from there, because it's sort of sloped towards where the gate is, flows from there over the tiles out the gate. And so the reason I put that lip there was to prevent exactly that from that little area from flooding regularly, right? And the reason I didn't put it on the left was because the tree on the left got a lot more sun, and a less water coming from the roof would create sort of films over that one. And so I do think that if you add all of these things in aggregate, all the things we've mentioned, the fact that the one tree was growing for a longer period than the other one, the fact that the one was slightly more to the left and blocked by the cement block, the fact that it had pieces of all sorts of things preventing drainage, and then you add the fact that it's just getting that little bit more moisture from when it rains, where the other one is not having that occur. That subtle difference can be enough to be the difference between life and death in that situation for these two trees. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Helena, good to see you here. Helena says, I believe the trees need more open ground. Okay. Well, the situation here was you either have no trees or you have a situation like this, and obviously the one tree has survived. It's not an ideal situation, but anyway, that's. Haven't you seen in supermarket situations like a mall? Sometimes they do, and even sidewalks all over the place, sidewalks in cities. You often have trees growing and flourishing in a situation like this. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you. I hope you guys have found this interesting. So we're now going to go on to Van Gogh letters, if I can find it. Let's just have a look here. So we're going to deal with the we're going to deal with January 7th of Van Gogh letters. And then I'm going to share with you guys, do you guys know that a Van Gogh painting was stolen? We're going to deal with that at the end of this episode. For those who are new, I don't know if there's anyone that's lurking. I have written a book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh. You can see it on screen over there. It's pretty well reviewed. It's, I think, my most well-reviewed books of the highest of 4.6 out of 5. So this is a pretty well-reviewed book. It's also available in paperback. But we're now going to deal with the letter from Vincent to his parents, right? It's kind of unusual because it's to his parents, dated the 7th of January, 1889. Now, the kind of reason why I'm telling you this story and going to all of this trouble to talk about subtlety is because in the context of Vincent van Gogh, it's also not clear one way or the other. It's not absolutely clear that that he cut off his ear. It's not clear that somebody else cut it off. It's just not clear. So, I'll put up my hand and say, when I wrote this book, let's just go back to it. When I wrote this book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, I don't think I set out to prove that he didn't cut off his ear. I set out to prove that he didn't cut off his ear because he's mentally ill. In other words, I was trying to say, I don't think he cut off his ear because he was insane or something like that, right? Which is not going that far where you say, well, I don't think he cut off his ear. I'm basically saying it's not because of mental illness. And then, although I felt that I proved that, what surprised me in my research was to find that Paul Gauguin, the guy who was staying with him at the time, was a pugilist, which is a boxer, and a fencer, and he had swords in the house with him. And he actually writes to Van Gogh afterwards to say, would you mind sending my fencing equipment, my masks, my gloves? I'm not sure if it's the swords themselves, because that's not really even mentioned. And so that did lead me to think, I wonder whether this story is true. And then one of the ways that I wanted to test whether it's true was, well, if a little piece of his ear was cut off, just like the earlobe, then I think maybe he could have cut off his own ear. But if the more of his ear that is cut off, what does that mean? And I think there are two ways of interpreting that. The one is, you could say, well, the more of his ear he cut off, the more mad he was, which is, I think, a popular but not very subtle way of trying to understand it. Whereas I think if you say, well, if he cut off the entire ear, is that more or less likely that he cut it off himself, right? So we're going to come back to this question of subtlety. I don't know, subtlety is such a useful tool in true crime cases that confound us. The John Benet Ramsey case, the Madeleine McCann case. Understanding child psychology is a much more subtle approach than whatever approaches have been done thus far. In terms of this letter to, the other thing I just wanted to mention is we live in a world that is very unsubtle. It's extremely obvious. I sort of feel like we've become a pornographized society where everything is really, really overt. Things are very, very unsubtle, if you know what I mean. And as a result of that, we have lost the ability to see subtle things or to recognize that subtle things exist. We are programmed that what you see is what you get, or we are programmed that things are obvious, when the reality is there are a lot of things that are not obvious. Valentine Bulby says, I'm sure I remember fencing type of men. That's interesting. Okay, so let's, thanks a lot, Stephanie, for putting the link there. So let's deal with this letter. The question you kind of want to ask yourself is, what are the subtleties in this letter? What is he not saying? What is he not revealing? What are the subtleties in this letter? And I often say, which I think is a really good example of my contribution to true crime in a sense, is I often say the absence of evidence is evidence, meaning where you would expect to see evidence, if you don't see evidence, that's very, in a way, explicit evidence of a sort as well. There's a hole where there should be something. Why isn't something there? And a really good example of that is, why are there not fingerprints on the Ramsey ransomware? You'd expect it to be there. So the fact that it isn't there is evidence of a sort, right? Okay, so now I really want you guys to turn on your subtle recognition antennae, right? And try and pick up obviously it's within the context that Van Gogh has just lost his ear. A lot of shit has gone down. His bromance with Gauguin is over. They've kind of broken up, right? And so what is he going to be telling his parents? And think about it. What would you tell your parents in the same circumstance? Would you say, Mom, Dad, I want to tell you I've had a massive breakdown. My life's fallen apart. It's all over. Please, can I come home? Is that what he's gonna say? What would you expect him to say? So let's have a look at the subtlety in this letter. Okay, let's do it. Okay. So it's dated 7 January. It's a little bit more than a week after the incident. Dear mother and sister. It's interesting, he's only writing to one sister. I think he's actually got three. It says, for several weeks, I have firmly intended to write you a word or two to wish you a truly prosperous and happy new year. Well, I'm pretty late in doing this. Why do you think that that's the case? He's not saying for a week, for the past week. He's not saying for the past couple of days, I'm meant to say happy new year. He's saying for several weeks, which is at least 2 weeks. But if you look at the letters to his own brother that dry up, something happens to him that is a bit unusual. Something happens to him in December that is a bit unusual. He says, I think you may feel inclined to excuse me if I tell you that in December I was indisposed. So he's kind of saying, well, I hope you'll excuse me for not writing, right? But in another way, isn't he asking something else? Can you excuse me for something else that I may have done? Can you excuse me for some embarrassment or scandal that I might be responsible for? But he's basically writing to say, will you excuse me, right? And he says, guess what? In December, he doesn't say over Christmas or over New Year. He says in December, in other words, the whole month. In December, I was indisposed. And look at those words, I was indisposed. Pretty subtle way of communicating that something was wrong, right? There's a very kind of clever turn of phrase. I was indisposed. What does that mean? Something was wrong, but I'm politely not telling you what it was. I mean, think about it. He's writing this letter minus an ear. He's about to be kicked out of his home. His friend has deserted him. His brothers come from Paris to collect Gauguin, right? And he basically says, well, I was indisposed. Do you think he's being transparent about what really happened to him? I mean, if he was being transparent, he'd say, Mom, jeepers, my ear's really, really hurting. Wait, I'm going to press my fingers against my ear. There's some blood from my ear. You can see how bad it is, kind of thing. And like press that, leave an imprint on the letter. Then he says, I was indisposed, but at the same time, I can inform you that I've completely recovered. And I'm at work again and everything is normal. So if you're an art expert, do you take him at his word? Has he completely recovered? Is he back to work again? Is everything normal? Is what he's saying true here? And I suppose you could also say, is he lying? Is he lying about that? Is lying the right word? Yeah, so Mel says is underestimating a situation, is hiding the truth. You could say is minimizing it, right? Silent Murmur says, yeah, okay. So I think it's true that he's back to work, and I think it's not true that everything is normal. He's about to go to the asylum. It's definitely not normal. He doesn't have an ear. That's a pretty extreme thing to happen. It's definitely not normal. But I do think it's interesting that he says, I have completely recovered, because it deals with this idea: can you completely recover from insanity? I'm just talking about the people who believe he cut off his ear because he's insane. Does that mean he hasn't completely recovered from that, and that insanity has remained with him? Or is there an aspect that is true about this, that he has recovered from whatever? I'm talking about with Van Gogh within in terms of his own self. Has he completely recovered, in a sense, from the sort of emotionally raw thing that was going on, where Gauguin was staying with him, kind of thing? It's a little bit of a half 12 of one, what, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other argument, because you could say, well, he's not telling the truth here anyway. But if you think about it, if he's not insane, hasn't he, in a sense, completely recovered himself in terms of he's recovered emotionally? Not completely. I don't think it's true that he's completely recovered, but hasn't he recovered substantially from something that happened? And I suppose you could then ask, well, what could happen where someone could completely, but not completely recover from that, but nevertheless recover from that? And the answer is, well, what if he drank a lot? What if he was very hungover? What if he was aroused in some way sexually, or in a agitated state of agitation because of a certain dynamic that was playing out, and that dynamic is now completely gone? The one person is left, and that and the next thing, right? But do you see my point? I think there's some truth in the sense that he has recovered, because they are releasing him from the hospital. I mean, think about it like that. He may. Is this about him recovering his mental health, or recovering his physical health? And that's the other subtle thing in the story, is it's always a little bit of both. It's always a little bit of both. Yeah, he wants them to see him as completely recovered, right? Okay, anyway, let's continue. He says, although it is winter here too, and what is worse, part of the country is flooded, at times we have a good deal milder weather than you do in Holland. So this gives us a little insight into the conditions that are unfavorable. Just like for the tree, this tree died in winter, died because it rained more in this winter than it would normally. But the point is, it didn't die in summer when it's hot and the water would dry up a lot quicker. This happens to Van Gogh in winter, and not only that, he says part of the country is flooded. And what I think he means by that is the countryside around us here is flooded. Now, if you think about that, if it's cold and certain parts are flooded and it's been raining a lot, doesn't that mean he's been indoors a lot, and his movement has been restricted? And if you are, and it says it at the middle to end of December, he says that he's been having arguments with Gauguin, and they've been electric, right? Now, if it's winter and it's too cold to go out, and it's wet and rainy and things are flooded, even if you wanted to go out, could you? In the sense of, well, it's flooded, you can't actually go out in these really cold and wet circumstances. So you ending up pushed in the same way that this tree is becoming very aware of all these obstructions in the hole that it's in, right? The brick, the cable, the plastic pipe, the concrete block. Van Gogh is also finding himself, what's the word? Not at living cheek by jowl, yes, but also at a lot closer quarters with Gauguin than he thought he would be. right? Because Van Gogh's also used to going out for walks in the countryside quite a lot. He's used to a certain amount of um, not being indoors, and probably Gauguin as well. So both of them, both these men, are finding themselves trapped and becoming more and more aware that they are incompatible, that they have a different view of things, but they can't kind of escape because of the weather, right? Okay, so he says, be so kind as to take good note of the fact that I'm writing to you these few words in case Theo is told about my having been indisposed for a while. So he's kind of doing a bit of public relations here. He's saying, listen, the fact that I'm writing to you, you should realize I'm actually okay. I don't know what Theo said to you. Now, do you think Van Gogh could be so mad, so compromised, so insane that I mean, let me put it this way. If Van Gogh was so emotionally compromised, he wouldn't be capable of thinking in this way. Like, oh shit, what are my family thinking about? What did Theo say to them? I'm just saying, if he was so compromised by his insanity, he wouldn't be capable of thinking to that level, right? I mean, does he really care what his mother and sister think about? I'm sure he does, but I think he also cares what Theo thinks about and what the people closer to him think about. The fact that he's capable of worrying what people far away think about him shows that he's pretty compos mentis. Does that make sense? And so in that sense, he has recovered. He's sort of realized, oh shit, what are they thinking about me? So he has recovered to the extent where he's doing public relations control, right? Then he says, however, I hope he understood of his own accord that it was not worth troubling to, I think it should be troubling you to inform you of it. Anyway, he says, but so there may be no worrying on your part, nor even any question of it, I'm writing you myself. Now, Van Gogh, so the subtle thing to ask here is, on the one hand, you could say, I don't think he's being completely transparent. I don't think he's telling the full story. On the other hand, I think you can also ask, is he so insane that he's lost touch with reality, right? And the way I interpret this is that he hasn't lost touch with reality. What he's trying to do is preserve the status quo. In other words, he doesn't want his mother and sister and brother talking amongst themselves and saying, you know what, Vincent's not, we need to bring him back. This isn't working out. He's struggling. We need to rescue him. He's basically saying, something happened. I was indisposed. I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm okay now, right? And I want to flip the thing around, where if you had to say the following, if you had to say, what if Van Gogh was really in dire straits? In other words, he had cut off his own ear. He was feeling really unhappy, feeling really lost and alone and afraid, right? Wouldn't he reach out to his family and say, guys, can you help me? Let me say that again. We've gone through hundreds of his letters by now, and it's not an exaggeration to say that. We've literally gone through hundreds of his letters. He's a guy with a thick skin, is quite resilient, but he's not invulnerable. He's someone who is quite a tough person, I think, psychologically. And there are times when he's worn down, when he is a bit beat down, and when those times do happen, he is quite willing to ask for help, to say, Theo, I really need money, please help me. Or I'm really struggling with, I only had 4 cups of coffee. I've only had 5 warm meals in the last 6 months. So he is capable of saying when he's in distress, right? And the fact that he's defending himself, he's saying, please don't please don't trouble yourself. It's a little bit like Gabby Petito. He's saying, please don't ruin this adventure. There has been a setback, but I'm okay, right? And obviously things aren't okay, but he's basically saying, I think I can handle this. Just like Gabby Petito thought she could handle the situation she was in, right? So Silent Murmur says, I don't think Vincent wanted to be pitied. Okay, so let's continue. So he says, for this very reason, I postponed answering Jet Move's letter, which, however, I hope to do shortly. So that's another letter he hasn't gotten to. And why is that? I don't think he's been, like if you say indisposed, I don't think he's been mentally ill for a month, unless you call being drunk and debauchery mental illness. I suppose you could. I think all of that culminated in some sort of conflagration. But the point is, for whatever reason, for most of December, Van Gogh was sort of unusually out of touch with his brother, with his parents, with Jet, with people in general. And so, what do you think was happening in this period when he's unusually out of touch? When he says, I was indisposed, what is he doing? Well, I think it was a combination of wine, woman, song, and disaster. I think it is a mixture of fun and games, and then maybe doing something excessively, and that then led to the beginning of a lot of arguments, something like that. But certainly Gauguin was an unusual addition. Gauguin was something different that happened to Van Gogh in within this whole context of him losing his ear. In the very same way, you can say Dr. Gachet was an unusual, was an aberration in a sense to what is going on with Van Gogh in the last month of his life. That person, Dr. Gachet. And then the question that, and again, it's a subtle question, is, was this man, Paul Gauguin, upset with Van Gogh because Van Gogh was antisocial or acting in a certain way? Or did they have an argument over a woman? Or was Van Gogh unreasonable because of his feelings towards a woman? And something that's very subtle with Paul Gauguin is, I don't know if you guys remember, he left Pont-Aven. When he left Pont-Aven, sort of in September the previous year, he was actually in love with Bernard's sister. Do you remember that? He was telling her not to telling her not to marry someone because he was thinking of eloping with her. In other words, he was thinking, he's married. He was thinking of running away with Bernard's sister. But then her father intervened, and then he came to all. It was under those circumstances. So you've got a 30-something man who's very, what's the word? Falling in love with women and womanizing, I guess, is the right word. And maybe that's also the ultimate reason why he wanted to go back, because he was in love with this woman. Couldn't there have been a similar situation with Van Gogh, that Van Gogh either witnessed women that he was bringing home, much like Meredith Kirch and Amanda Knox, or fell in love with a woman and Gauguin kind of stole her from him, or something like that. But because there is a woman involved in the ear incident, right? By the same token, and this is what I'm talking about with subtlety. It's not explicitly in the narrative. In the same way, in the last summer Van Gogh, a father may have gotten really upset with him. Was it because he had developed feelings for his daughter? I'm talking about Marguerite Gachet. Well, if you go through the history of Van Gogh, he's constantly having inappropriate feelings towards women, and he's got a very romantic attitude, because he's reading these novels that are all about people having sexual adventures, and he wants to have his sexual adventure. Think about it, Van Gogh. What is quite idiosyncratic about Van Gogh is, well, his brother gets engaged, right? Paul Gauguin has been married. Paul Gauguin has got this girlfriend with Bernard. Everyone is kind of in some sort of relationship in terms of the arc of the story, except Van Gogh. Do you think he wants to be in a relationship? I think he does. It could be that. Okay, anyway, let's continue. So he says, my having been unwell. So look at the words he chooses: unwell, indisposed. What is the other thing that he said? I mean, he uses the word recovered, which makes you think about some kind of illness. But indisposed is also quite a weird word. Like, have you ever said, I've been indisposed? Basically means I'm not available. So he says indisposed, recovered, but here then he says I've been unwell. He says that has provided the opportunity for getting acquainted with quite a number of people, and I think it's probable that I shall have to do a number of portraits. I so much hope everything is all right with you, especially your health. As for myself, my having been indisposed, it's about the third time he's using that word, for a few days, right? Is that true for him to say I've been indisposed for a few days? I don't know if that is true. He basically lost his ear somewhere around the 23rd, 24th of December. It's now the 7th of January. So it's about 2 weeks. It's not just a few days. It's about 2 weeks at least. And then you could also count what was going on in the week before that. He says, I mean, just think about what he's saying here. My having been indisposed for a few days has refreshed me considerably. So it's almost like saying, me being sick for a few days has made me feel really healthy. I mean, he's really is being not cagey. What's the right word? Is being kind of cryptic, right? You agree? He's been kind of cryptic in what he's saying. He says, and I think there's a chance that there will be nothing the matter with me for a long time to come. Well, that is going to be absolutely not the case. There will be something is going to matter for a long time to come. But what we see here is another example, another symptom of him minimizing something serious. I don't know if you remember when he wrote to Gauguin, he said, I hope you're not going to hold anything against me or the little. No, actually, he wrote his brother, he wrote to Theo, and he said, Gauguin is not very happy with me, with the little yellow house, and especially with me. Don't you think that was an understatement? I mean, we know now in retrospect it was, but he does have this way of speaking in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way that is understatement. When he says here, I haven't been well for a few days, but it's actually refreshed me completely, is it kind of an understatement for what has really happened? Because if you, like, it's not rocket science again, if you read between the lines here, nowhere in this letter does he say, Mom, sis, guess what? I've only got one ear. He never mentions that's the case, and that's this blatant, obvious thing that has happened. He also doesn't mention, I've had big arguments with this guy and he's left the building. It's not in this letter. As far as I know, it's not. Let's go to the rest of it. He says, meanwhile, I shall be very pleased to get a letter from you one of these days. Although it is rather a thing of the future, I suppose you are often thinking of Theo's intended visit to you. I should not be greatly surprised if he went a little earlier than usual this year. that is before the exhibition instead of after. So he's even aware of, well, let me ask you guys, what exhibition do you think he's talking about? What do you think? It's now it's January in the year 1889. What exhibition that he's referring to here, what do you think he's talking about? I think so too. It is quite an old word. I wouldn't say it's like archaic, but it is pretty old. What is this exhibition that they're talking about? There you go. Well done. Well done, Alina. So I think it's the World Fair. It could be another thing, but just think about how rotten the timing is. Just at this moment where there's this tremendous opportunity for Van Gogh to prove his worth, he's going to basically be indisposed for that entire year. This tremendous opportunity for artists to kind of peacock their way, show their work. Well, at the beginning of that year, Van Gogh has lost his ear and is basically going to lose his opportunity to participate in that. And if you think about it, he was very rigged and ready. He was talking about, I'm going to do 100 works of art, and he was talking about all these series he was going to do. He was preparing to be ready for this World Fair, and now he's suffered a serious setback. And that's another reason why you can understand why he would say, I'm okay, I've completely recovered, don't worry, I'm fine. It's because, like Gabby Petito, Van Gogh wants to Van Gogh wants to participate in the World Fair. Van Gogh wants to have his shot. Van Gogh wants his art adventure to continue, right? That's what he's thinking about. And so I think a very sensible argument would be, if there was no World Fair, if there was nothing else riding on the other side of this event, I think Van Gogh would have been more honest and more, what's the word? I think he would have been willing to say what had happened, willing to reveal more details of what had happened. But why is he not willing? Well, because his family are basically going to decide whether to support him in this aftermath or not. And so it's in his interest to minimize it. Anyway, he says, but all the same, he will have to act according to the circumstances. It could not help. So I could not help thinking of you rather often these days, be assured of that. Do you think that's true, that he was thinking of them often? Well, I think what probably happened is he completely forgot certain things that were going on. Like he was completely out of his mind, but based on substances he was using and based on certain behavior. And probably when he was lying in bed, recovering, that is probably when he did think of them. But I don't think he thought of them before that. Otherwise, he would have written to them. Okay, so let's go on to the next letter. So do you guys see what I'm saying about just how valuable subtlety is? If you read a letter like we've just read, and you see just how every single line there has subtle undertones to it, right? Just as in a way we have subtle undertones to ourselves. I've just read from this book where they say just saying a number, just exposing a person to a number is going to change your psychology. Just saying certain words in a way triggers sort of flowers of psychological patterns that we acknowledge inwardly and conceal outwardly, right? yeah, he wasn't terribly close with his mother. No, he wasn't. Okay, so let's deal with this letter. I think we're gonna do this until about the 2 hour mark, and then I'll deal with the painting that was stolen. Okay. My dear Thea, I hope it will not amaze you too much. So he writes this letter on the same day. He's doing quite a lot of patching up, right? I wrote you a letter this morning. I add a few lines the same evening. So yeah, I've actually forgot to mention this. Some things that are subtle are also incredibly obvious, and some things that are obvious are actually quite subtle. What I mean is, if you take the previous letter, that we dealt with, what I don't understand is if you are one of these art historians that has played into this cliche that Van Gogh is mad, it was mentally ill. How can you read that letter, whether you think that he's telling the truth or not? That letter is incredibly sensible from the beginning to the end. The letter itself stands as a symptom of someone who has the wherewithal to compose a letter, and you can only do that if you are composed to some extent. That letter is proof that is composed, um, and probably shielding something which is even further proof of his composure. You can't have composure if you in the sort of raw state of madness. And that is what I find incomprehensible, that people can read this stuff and say, yeah, how he died in the end, asylum, all of that adds to madness. Because his letters certainly don't, his letters detract from that idea. Yeah, well said. Okay, so let's read this letter. It's quite interesting that this painting is referenced at this time, because I mean that's the situation he's in. He sort of feels like almost a zombie that's being examined by people. That painting is resonating with him, and is remembering it while he's in this particular situation. Cut open. Anyway, he says, I hope it will not amaze you that I wrote this letter. He says, there's several days that I could not write, but you see clearly that this is over now. You see what he's saying there. He's kind of communicating the same thing, is on message in both letters. Can you see it's over? Don't worry. I've written a note to Mother and Will and addressed it to our sister with the sole intention. There you have it. Do you think that that is true when he says, I've written this with the sole intention of setting their minds at rest? Do you think that that statement is true? So I see in terms of the votes, make sure you vote if you haven't. Are you very good at subtlety? 48% say yes, half of you. 29% say no, almost a third, and 90% say I'm not sure. Now, I think if you say I'm not sure or no, you're probably going to become better at it. If you've said yes, I want to encourage you to describe yourself as not very, or as capable of doing better at it, and then you will. Okay. Okay, so anyway, I think it was absolutely his sole intention to set their minds at rest. I think that is 100% correct. He says, just tell them on your part. So, yeah, now he's trying to get Theo, trying to tell Theo what to say to them as well. He says, just tell them I've been a bit beat. So, it's like this, what Vincent's thinking is, what the hell is Theo going to say about me? Theo actually saw me. Theo, more than anyone else, knows what really happened to me, or has an idea of what really happened to me, saw me. He was with Gogh. That makes it even worse. What did Gogh say to him? So here you have Vincent he's got so much alacrity, is so aware, is so alert that he's telling his brother what to say to his mother. That is how conscious he is, right? And so if you think about it, that explanation, what does that mean to say, I've been a bit beat? I think he means I've been trying to think of a simple way of saying it. I've been worn down. I've been worn out. I've been tired, right? Do you agree with that? That's what he means with the word beat. Let's just have a look at, it's quite an interesting word to use if you really want to go into it, because the word beat means, do it full screen like that. The word beat, if you look at the various meanings, it means hit, strike, batter, thump, hammer, punch, knock, thrash, right? And isn't that what happened to Vincent? Didn't someone strike his ear? It also means defeated, defeat, conquer, get the better of, vanquish. Isn't that what Gogh did? He got the better of his artistic, not rival, but counterpart. There's the informal, and I think that's probably what he's driving at. Completely exhausted. I'm beat, completely exhausted. But it's an interesting word that also implies being struck by something. Okay, so let's go on to, he says, the way that I used to be in the past when I had that venereal trouble in The Hague and that I got myself looked after in the hospital. So it seems like he's saying to Theo, please tell, I'm not going to, I haven't told them, but you please tell them that I think the reason Vincent ended up in hospital was because of venereal trouble. And you can kind of imagine that they would, yeah, we do use that. We that they would believe that they wouldn't have trouble believing that that was what had happened. And I think there's some truth in that. I think there is some truth in that. But obviously, that's not why I ended up in hospital. Then he says, only that is not worth mentioning since I've completely recovered and that I was only in the aforesaid hospital for a few days. Can you see how Van Gogh's quite sort of mischievous? He's quite calculated. He's quite clever in how he's trying to weasel his way out of this by constructing a narrative for his brother to give to his mother and sister. And he writes it all in the same day. He's quite energetic in his sort of mischief. Then he says, in this way, your information will square with the note which I have made them swallow at home in Holland. I don't know, when I read that, it seems like he's saying, please say this. I find this fascinating from a true crime perspective because it seems like he's saying, please say this, because when he says will square means it'll correspond, right? He's saying, say this, and that will then be the same version. When he says, I've made them swallow, it's like saying that I've duped them with, that I've conned them with. Give them the story so that they'll also swallow, swallowed in that sense, right? So can you see that something, when you look at the tone of this, your information needs to square with the note that I wrote so that they swallow what we said back in Holland. You kind of get the sense that both brothers are colluding in terms of a version of events, right? Do you follow what I'm saying? That both brothers are going to tell a story that is probably not true, and this story is intended for their family, Theo's family, Vincent's family, right? And this is where it gets really interesting. Isn't this a little bit like incident on December 23rd in the John Benet Ramsey case, that something happened that caused people to dial 911, and then they decided to deal with it privately. And then another incident happened 2 days later, and then that's exactly what they did. It was a what do you call it? Like going through the motions. It was almost like a drill, but without knowing it was a drill, right? And so in the same way, what happens here, doesn't the same thing happen? So in terms of the ear incident, when Van Gogh dies, that they decide to handle it in exactly the same way. We're not going to tell the truth. We're going to have a story that they're going to be able to swallow at home in Holland. Does that make sense? Do you see that I'm not manufacturing this out of thin air? There actually is a basis for thinking this, which is what I present in my book. And then he says, and so by so doing, it'll be very difficult for them to get into a stew about it. I hope you will think the stratagem innocent enough. So there it is in plain language. That's the strategy of dealing with the actual story of whatever happened. So in other words, there's a real story of what happened, and he's very cleverly worked out what words he's going to use and what he's going to say. Also, you will see by this that I've not yet forgotten how to jest once in a while. I'm going to set to work again tomorrow. I shall begin by doing one or two still lifes so as to get back into the habit of painting. Roulard has been splendid to me, and I dare say that he will remain a lasting friend. I shall have need enough of that still, for he knows the country well. We had our dinner together today. I think that's another thing to think about is if Van Gogh was this crazy lunatic, someone who could cut off his ear at any moment, do you think the postman would still be his pal? If you knew someone who was that out of control, would you want to still spend time with them, or would you be very cautious and not really want to socialize? Anyway, he says, as soon as I feel somewhat up to it, I hope to do his portrait. Last Sunday, I met another doctor who knows his Delacroix and Dechavannes, at least theoretically, and is very curious about Impressionism. I think I can hope to become better acquainted with him. I think that the engraving of the anatomy lesson is stocked by Francois Buffer and Sons, and that the net price should be from 12 to 15 francs. We had better have it framed here to save the cost of transportation. I assure you that some days at the hospital were very interesting, and perhaps it is from the sick that one learns how to live. Quite an interesting statement. Like if you take that tree that we spoke about earlier, that tree is going to help me keep the other one alive. That what happened to that tree that died is going to help protect. The lessons learned are going to be applied to the tree that has survived. He says, I hope I have just had simply an artist's fit, and then a lot of fever after very considerable loss of blood. So yeah, he seems to be speaking, casually and honestly to Theo. And he says, I hope what has happened is I've just had an artist's fit. And then a lot of fever after very considerable loss of blood. I think he did have a fever. Is that fever just the natural fever of infection? Is that fever also got to do with him suffering from syphilis, or is it both? And it is true, he did suffer a very considerable loss of blood. He says, as an artery was severed. Now, I don't want to kind of be silly about this, but, when I wrote my book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, I did a study of the ear, and you do see that right at the top of the ear, this sort of part of the ear, right at the top, is an artery. So in order to sever an ear from the top to the bottom, you begin by cutting through an artery. It would be very difficult for anyone to cut through that artery and then persist. It would be slippery. It would be a very slick, difficult affair, besides it being extremely painful. Not only that, the cartilage of the ear, it's not like you're cutting through cotton. You're cutting through quite a tough material, right? And it's not very easy to do. It's not like you've got something in front of you. It's something that you can, in a way, only use maybe one hand to do. And it's extremely painful. Anyway, he says, my appetite came back at once, my digestion is all right, and my blood recovers from day to day. And in the same way, serenity returns to my brain day by day. It's interesting here, the closest he comes to talking about his ear is an artery, and he says considerable loss of blood. He doesn't actually mention his ear at all either. So he says, please quite deliberately forget your unhappy journey and my illness. And that's how he describes it, as an illness. Is that the right word for what happened to him? I mean, yeah, look at the various words we've had. Indisposed, beat up, basically saying I've got venereal disease, then artist fit, and now illness. Well, which one is it? You see that I'm doing what you asked and writing you what I feel and think. Now, that's quite interesting that Theo said, tell me how you feel. Tell me how you really feel. And he says, I've done that. On your part, follow this meeting with the bongers up quietly. I hope it will continue as a lasting friendship and that perhaps it will be even more. If I stay here, it is because for the moment I might not be able to transplant myself. After some time, we can go over the pros and cons of the situation and figure things out again. That final paragraph is really the bottom line. It's the question that is overriding literally everything is, can I stay here? Will I stay here? And he's thinking to himself, if I stay here, what will happen? He's saying, I might not be able to transplant myself, which is another way of saying, I can't leave this place. I need to stay here. He's invested so much time and energy in the yellow house, right? What's wrong with Chelsea? Oh, wow, COVID. That's really, I'm really sorry to hear that. Stephanie, are there new boosters out, or new, is there a new brew that has come out, presumably to deal with this new strain? I don't know if you guys know that Stephanie works in a pharmacy. Anyway, we all wish you well, Chelsea. Hope you do feel better. By the way, I might as well tell you guys, I'm planning on coming to America next month, and I'm a little bit concerned about COVID because of exactly this, hearing about someone that you know that's got it. So the only way to, I mean, I've already booked my flight, to be honest. The only way to sort of go and mitigate the risk is to sort of, on the plane, wear a mask. At the airport, wear a mask. I'm really not looking forward to that aspect, but what do you do? Just stay at home? I don't know. Well, Kerrigan says, I've just got the new booster last Friday. I don't think there's anything like that available in South Africa. So, Stephanie, will I be able to get that in America? Will I be able to come and see you in the pharmacy and kind of get a booster? Because I think I might need to do that. Yeah, I know of someone in England whose son has COVID, and also she says many of his classmates. So it's also happening there. Yeah, especially on the plane. Yeah. Okay, so you guys want me to read one more letter to see who it is to? Well, it's a third letter from Vincent to Theo. So his third letter on the 7th of January. You guys want me to read it, or are you guys ready for me to wrap up? Okay, let's go through it. Okay, remember super chats minimum that is my goal for these Van Gogh letters is $12, but that was when I was doing, what is it, 10 2 a week. But anyway, if you guys can contribute a super chat, I'd appreciate it, especially since I'm going to America. It doesn't have to be a lot, but if you can contribute something small, $2, whatever, it's better than nothing. Okay, anyway, let's do this, and then we're going to do the painting, that Van Gogh painting that was stolen. We'll deal with that next. Okay, my dear Theo, perhaps I shall not write you a very long letter today, but anyway, a line to let you know that I got back home today. So he went back to the yellow house. So he obviously has been, in a sense, he has completely recovered, in the sense that he's been released, that he's been, thanks so much, Sharon, I appreciate it, that he's been, what do they call it? Not released from hospital, he's been, what's that word when you're in hospital and then they let you out? What's the word for that? Can't think of the word anyway. You know what I mean? He says, I do so regret that you had all that trouble for such a trifle. Forgive me, who am I after all? Probably the primary cause of it all. So yeah, he's kind of blaming himself, but why would he say I'm the primary cause of it? I mean, if he cut off his own ear, obviously he's the primary cause of it all. So why would he need to say that? He says, I did not foresee that it would be important enough for you to be told of it. That's the other thing. If you think about Van Gogh deliberately cutting off his ear, you can also imagine he's conscious enough. You would imagine that he would, and I could be wrong, but you would imagine that he could be conscious enough to imagine that if he cuts off his own ear, it's going to bring Theo there, and that's not going to be good. Think about also the aftermath of this. He does something, right? Do you think he does it without knowing what the consequences are going to be? Because he does so much knowing what the consequences are going to be. Anyway, interesting to think about. He says, I did not foresee that it would be important enough for you to be told of it. And that is what he didn't anticipate. He didn't anticipate that Gauguin would go. It was Gauguin who told his brother. Enough. Monsieur Ray came to see the paintings with two of his friends, doctors, and they were uncommonly quick at understanding at least what complementaries are. I now intend to do a portrait of Monsieur Ray and possibly other portraits as soon as I am a little used to painting again. That's the other thing that I think does, to some extent, prove that he has recovered, which is the fact that he's able to paint, he's able to write letters, he's able to do both. Thanks for your last letter. Indeed, I always feel your presence, but do realize on your side that I'm working at the same thing as yourself. How I wish you had seen the portrait of Brias by Delacroix and the whole Montpellier Musée where Gauguin took me. Since others before us, that's the other thing that's quite interesting, he's not really talking about Gauguin. He's not really even referring to him. You'd think if he cut off his own ear and Gauguin was in some way innocent in that, that he would say, put in a good word for Gauguin. He doesn't seem to be terribly happy about Gauguin. He's leaving him out. The absence of evidence is, he says, since others before us have worked in the South, indeed it is rather difficult for me to believe that we are so far astray as all that. As for its being a hot country, my word, I can't help thinking of a certain country Voltaire talks of, not to mention the simple castles in the air. These are the thoughts which occur to me as I come back to my own house. I'm very anxious to know how the bongers are and if the relations with them continue. I hope so. If you agree, now that Gauguin is gone, we will put the money back again at 150 francs. I think that now I shall see calmer days here than in the past year. What I greatly need for my better information are all the reproductions of Delacroix's pictures that are still available at that shop where they sell. I think at a franc a piece, lithographs of the artists, ancient and modern, etc. I most certainly don't want the more expensive ones. How are our Dutch friends De Haan and Isaacson? Well, Kat Kruger, I didn't actually know you in the house. Good to see you here. Silent Murmur, thanks very much as well. Thanks. Yeah, he says he's getting used to paintings. Thanks a lot, guys. Only I think that we must still keep quiet with regard to my own painting. If you want any pictures, certainly I can send you some already, but when my peace of mind comes back to me, I hope to do different things. So there's an admission that his peace of mind has been disrupted. And I mean, isn't it obvious that it would be? If you're the most sane person in the world and you lose your ear, no matter how or when or why, you're probably not going to have peace of mind, right? I hope to do different things. Hopefully, as to the independence, do what seems best to you and what the others do. But you have no idea how much regret that your journey to Holland has not yet come off. After all, we cannot alter what has happened, but make up for it yourself by letter or any way you can, as far as possible, until the bongers how I regret having involuntarily caused this delay. That's an interesting word. I mean, if he voluntarily cut off his ear, right? It's interesting that he says, I'm sorry, I involuntarily caused this delay. I shall be writing Mother and Will one of these days, and I must also write Jet Mo. Write me soon and set your mind at rest about my health. It will completely cure me to know that things are going well with you. What is Gauguin doing? As his family are in the north and he has been invited to exhibit in Belgium. So can you see he's kind of seeing why Gauguin left. His family are in the north. He's been invited to exhibit. He's had success in Paris. Basically, he's done what he wants to do. Gauguin is looking out for Gauguin. Think about how Vincent is thinking about other people to some extent in a selfish way. I mean, he's thinking about others in the context of himself, but he's nevertheless writing to his mother and his sister and his brother, and he's asking them about their health and their relationships with other people. And he doesn't just, it's not just about himself, it's also to some extent, he takes an interest in others. And think about the kind of person Van Gogh is, sensitive and emotional, compared to Gauguin, who's emotional and I think insensitive and very selfish. He says, I like to think that he has landed on his feet, a good handshake in spite of everything. I'm terribly happy that this is a thing of the past. Once more, a good hearty handshake. That is also a kind of, excuse my French, mindfuckery. He's kind of saying, I'm terribly happy that this is a thing of the past. It's a kind of a way of saying to Theo, put this behind us, it's over, right? It's quite a clever communicator, right? So we'll continue Van Gogh letters with episode 72. Well, there's another letter on the 7th of January. Anyway, we'll deal with that letter in the next episode. And that is from Joseph Roulin, the postman, to Wilhelmina Van Gogh. And something tells me that Van Gogh asked him to write that letter to Wilhelmina. He's really doing damage control, isn't he? So I'm going to finish off this live stream by, first of all, I'm going to share this. I'm not going to read this article now, but I'm going to share it with you in the link. Thanks a lot, Valentine. It's a really interesting article against subtlety, saying subtlety sucks. And he kind of makes the case right at the end, where he talks about, I don't know how well you guys know The Great Gatsby, but he says, this is kind of the bottom line of the article. He says, The Great Gatsby is a book that renders all criticisms of its unsubtlety ridiculous. The whole book is about the appeal of a man who favors loud colors and bold gestures. You could also argue that Van Gogh's art is not subtle. Monogrammed shirts and great fireworks displays of exuberance and wealth. Jay Gatsby comes out and says what he means, even when it means spelling out the themes of the book. Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can. There's one character of that book who hates Gatsby's parties, who thinks he can't be an Oxford man because of his pink suit. When we demand subtlety, privileging mask and minimalism over on-the-sleeve feeling and on-the-nose meaning, we turn ourselves into a bunch of Tom Buchanans. Now, if you know the Great Gatsby, you know that Tom Buchanan was this objectionable, insufferable, privileged arsehole. It was Daisy's husband, and he's not a very likable character, and he's cheating on Daisy and he's having an affair, but he's capable of being surreptitious and subtle. And the writer is saying, he's talking about the case for heavy-handedness in art, right, in writing, and he's saying, who wants to be a Tom Buchanan? And although I agree that Tom Buchanan is the dark side of subtlety and the ugly side of subtlety, what about the other character? What is his name again? The guy who writes the book, who gets to know Jay Gatsby. Who's that character? In any event, he's the what's his name again? Just played by. Let me just see if I can. Just played by Tobey Maguire. What is his name again? Can you guys remember? So that is the Buchanan character, Daisy and Jay Gatsby, and basically saying, and in my opinion, he was also quite a subtle character. He wasn't. He was. Anyway. Yeah, I agree with that. So it's quite an interesting article. I'll put it in the link. You guys can check it out. Just interesting to think about the idea of being unsubtle in art. Is that the way to go, right? And certainly Van Gogh is unsubtle, but I think there is subtlety in art that works. Think about the Mona Lisa, the Mona Lisa smile. Okay, so let's now go on to the last thing, which is the stolen Van Gogh painting. I hate these ads that come up like this. Okay, can you guys see that? Stolen Van Gogh painting worth millions returned in IKEA bag. And so I'm going to show you about 3 different articles. And that's also one way to, certainly a true crime researcher and a journalist, one way to find the subtleties in a story. Some people touch on it and some people miss it. You try and look at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or more stories, and then there's a little piece of information that someone puts in that somebody else doesn't put in. So in terms of this story, there you have a picture of the painting, and you're going to see a subtle thing regarding that. You get a sense, the painting is called The Parsonage Garden at Newnan. You get a sense of the size of this picture, right? But if you look, if you look closely, can you see the size of his fingers on the edge there, right? Do you think this picture is really the size that it pretends to be? But again, look at the size of his fingers on the edge there. right? Do you think this picture is really that size? Anyway, this article kind of talks about, so there you get the true size of that picture. Just look at the difference between that. Look at his face and his hands, and look at the proportion of that picture. You can see it's quite a small picture. It's a modest picture. It's almost like two A4 pieces of paper next to each other, maybe three. It's really not a big painting. So yeah, there's another article. I think is it this one? Where they actually show footage of this guy stealing this artwork. And let's quickly just watch it. So who says there's no true crime in the story Van Gogh? So this is a guy who broke into the gallery with a sledgehammer. Talk about unsubtle. There he goes. He's carrying the sledgehammer in his hand, breaks the next door. He's banging with a sledgehammer, goes in and emerges with the painting. There he goes, and then off he goes, right? And so the problem is, thanks a lot, Chelsea. Wow, you shouldn't be making such contributions when you're ill. Well, is it your birthday as well? Is it your birthday today? Wow. If it is, happy birthday. And yeah, I'm really glad that I don't know, is it serendipity that is at work here, that our friends are all together and we can wish you well. Wow, that is really amazing. Guys, let's all wish Chelsea happy birthday. Happy birthday, and please get well. And we love you, and we thinking about you, and it's really good to see you today, just by pure luck. So here's a little butterfly from me. But yeah, our thoughts are definitely with you, and I hope this has helped. It looks like it has made your day that little bit extra special. So let's just look at these birthday wishes from everybody: Valentine, Elise, Sharon, everybody. Happy birthday! Happy birthday! Happy birthday! So yeah, I'm sorry that it's under these circumstances, but definitely glad that we could have lightened it up a little bit, provide a little bit of sunshine. Kerrigan is also wishing you, and Lisa. So there we go. Cool. That's a really sweet little note to end on. Yeah. So your birthday is the 24th of September. Let's try and remember that. Lynn Lippy also says happy birthday. So I think there's something else I wanted to show you. The picture of the museum. I'm not sure if it's. I think it might be. I might be on this particular website. A picture of the museum. But anyway, there's the picture. There's that again, where you get to see the size of it. Not sure where the museum is. Is it not on this? It was on one of these articles. Anyway, it's not coming up now. Anyway, the very last thing I want to show you is this picture from Mars. This is a picture on Mars, and what they're trying to figure out is whether that used to be a river. And so it's the subtleties of sand, the subtleties of dirt. Does that show or prove that there was once a river, actually a fast flowing river on Mars? And because of the amount of subtlety that they just can't say one way or another, it looks that way. They think that that's the case. But because there are subtle things that it could be something else. So they don't know for sure. And so I just want to what's the word, conclude by basically saying we live in a world where obviousness, especially in social media is always patently obvious. Extroversion to some extent is rewarded and popular, but what the result of that is that we tend to assume that everything is obvious, and we kind of forget that. Um, there we go, back in focus. We kind of forget that there's a heck of a lot that is not obvious, and that's why we need to remind ourselves that we are not that good at seeing subtleties, that there are a lot of subtleties out there that we probably aren't seeing. And especially if you're in the true crime space, and especially if you're a student of nature, you realize just how much subtlety is going on that you're not aware of. I mean, I become very aware of, as someone who started gardening, and also someone who's got a weaver bird building nests right outside my balcony window, that that's normal for a weaver bird. It's normal for a weaver bird to build 20 nests in the space of about 12 months. 20 nests is pretty incredible. Um, that's normal for that bird. It's an incredible amount of energy. It's also, you know, so so the thing about subtlety is it can help you. And I've got to be aware of, I'm now going to travel within the subtlety of uh, a sickness that you can't see, right? And a sickness, airborne sickness is by its very nature subtle. And so I'm going to try and move from this side of the world to that side of the world without getting sick. And so I've got to be aware of those subtleties. That's just an example of it. And I'm just saying, I want to encourage you guys in this week that's going forward, to concentrate on being aware of subtle things that you have noticed but not really paid attention to. Please pay more attention to it. And what I think is going to happen is you're going to come, when we come back with episode 72, you'll more than likely tell me that there was a good result because you paid attention to something more than you otherwise would. So I want you to say to yourself right now, I'm very bad at being subtle. I'm going to try and be better. And then I want you to go out into this week and think about where you can improve in terms of critical thinking on subtle things, not obvious things, subtle things, things that kind of, and it's obviously you're not trying to solve crimes, or you're trying to solve um, invisible things that are in your fabric, wherever you are in the world. And hopefully that's going to help you uncover something that is right there, in the same way that I've uncovered not just one of these. There's actually another effective plug, and I've actually found a third one. You're going to find things that are hidden from view beneath the face of things that maybe you need to deal with. It might be health, it might be um, wiring in your home, it might be something in your garden, it might be somebody that you know. And just pay a little bit more attention than you would, and do that by basically saying, there are no anchors. We anchor our psychology around obvious things. I want you to try and search for things that aren't obvious for clues. We are anchored in our thinking by the obvious, but what if the obvious is wrong? What if truth and reality is more subtle? And I want you guys to go out into your lives this week with that in mind, and hopefully it's going to be a useful thing to apply. It was for me, it has been for me. So hopefully I can spread that amongst my little community. I'll be back probably in a week or two with the next episode. I'll then also share a little bit about my plans going to America, and maybe I can, if some of you want to meet me, maybe we can make some other arrangement. But I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that when we come together next time. Again, Chelsea, have a wonderful rest of your birthday. Big hug from me and from the rest of the peaches here. Karen says, where in America? Well, I'll be answering that. Karen, are you in Oregon? I seem to remember that you're in Oregon. No, I'm not going to relocate. It's just going to be a couple of weeks in America. No, I won't be bringing Timmy with. Yeah, life is very unpredictable, very unpredictable. Stephanie says, thanks. I will take care to do that. Stephanie, I want to thank you for being here. I know it's quite late where you are, and I know that you had other things going on. Thanks so much for being at short notice. I do wonder where the other Stephanie is. Stephanie L, if you're watching this on replay, good to see you. I am actually hoping to see both Stephanies in New York, in the New York area. I'm going to be seeing Stephanie in the Manhattan area and Stephanie H in the Connecticut area. So, but we'll see who else we can meet while I'm there. Oh, Wisconsin. Okay, sounds good. Thanks a lot, Kat Kruger. Thanks a lot, guys, for your super chats. Really appreciate it. And again, Chelsea, happy birthday. And I hope you have a really good rest of the evening. Maybe try and find a good movie. Are you in the mood for a scary movie? I can recommend a couple of scary movies. But if you've got Netflix, probably a movie, if you're not feeling very well, maybe you want to watch the movie How to Live to 100, Secrets of the Blue Zones. That's definitely pretty good. Okay. Timmy, come. You must come and say goodbye. Timmy, come. Timmy, come. Come, boy. Hey. Guys, it's 5 o'clock in the morning and it is pretty cold. It's unusually cold for this time. Timmy, come. Looks like I'm going to have to manipulate him. Do you want to go for a walk? Timmy, do you want to go for a walk? Come, let's go. Come. Come, boy. Timmy, come. Let's go for a walk. Timmy, come, let's go. Come. Come, let's go. Come, boy. Well, you know, he's not a dumb dog. And I think he's also learned that going for a walk, he doesn't always mean going for a walk. He needs other things like keys, jingling, and shoes that are being put on. And unless those things are part of the thing, then it's probably going to be a false alarm. So he's learned to understand those subtleties as well, definitely. Anyway, Timmy is very sleepy, and yeah, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. I've been up all night. I probably need to grab a pillow as well. Oh, shame, Timmy. Okay. Okay. Thanks, guys. Been, I think, quite a good live. I will see you guys within the next couple of days or a week or so. He has smartened up, that's for sure. Sherlock Timmy. Okay, guys, all the best. See you guys next time. Ciao.